Welcome back to La Cour des Citoyens, our program explaining how you as a citizen are concretely concerned by European law and the decisions of the court in your everyday life. Today we will explore a topic of critical importance. How can you claim the respect of the rights you enjoy under EU law? In the second part of the show, I will be joined by my colleague Matija Longar. Together, we'll take a closer look at the most emblematic cases brought by the citizens. An important thing to understand is that European law forms an integral part of each national landscape and of every citizen's legal heritage. This means that national judges from your countries, are the ones responsible in the first place for applying EU law on a day-to-day basis. So, in other words, if you as a citizen feel that your rights under EU law are not respected, you need to turn to your country's judge and claim the enforcement of these rights. Then, if the national court, for instance, Judice di Pace of Rome or Lithuanian Aukščiausiasis Teismas, has doubts about how to interpret or apply EU Act establishing these rights, this court can request guidance from the Court of Justice. National courts can do it through the so-called preliminary ruling procedure. It is precisely this procedure that allows the citizens to bring indirectly their case to the Court of Justice. And exactly this procedure is at the origin of the most of the landmark cases delivered by the Court of Justice. It ensures that EU law is applied in the same way in all EU countries to the benefit of all EU citizens. But what happens if, on the contrary, you as a citizen believe that an EU act is unlawful? Is it possible to challenge it? Well, in that case, you can also use the preliminary ruling procedure and request your national judge to ask the Court of Justice to check whether this act is valid or not. In other situations, people, and also companies, by the way, can even challenge EU acts directly before the General Court. This is so where an EU institution, such as the Commission, the Parliament, or the Council, takes a decision addressed to a single person, for instance, a decision to deny access to documents, or impose a fine on a company. Under specific conditions, a direct action before the General Court can also be possible against an act of a more general scope, which concerns a particular person directly and individually. To summarize, how can citizens claim their rights under EU law? They can do it before national judges who are on the front line responsible for the application of European law. If a national judge has a doubt about the interpretation of an EU act or about its validity, the judge can seek guidance from the Court of Justice in Luxembourg through the preliminary ruling procedure. If an EU act concerns a citizen directly and individually, this citizen can challenge this EU act before the General Court. Now, it's time for a question. Look at these names: Defren, Bosman, Costa, Frankovic, among others. What do these individuals have in common? Well, they are all ordinary citizens who, through their legal battles, have profoundly shaped and made history in the EU law. Let's find out more with my colleague, Matija Longar. Welcome, Matija. You are administrator at the Registry of the Court of Justice. We've just spoken about the citizen implication in the procedures in front of the EU courts. And now let's have a quick look at the cases when an individual story has had an impact on EU case law. What comes into your mind?
What comes to mind is names some we've just seen, names of people such as Jean-Marc Bosman or Gabriel Defren, Andrea Frankovic or Ursula Becker, Rudik Željček, names of people who, by bringing a case before their national court, made history and changed EU law.
In what sense?
Well, if we take, for example, the case involving Gabrielle Defren, a Belgian flight attendant, her case is iconic for equal pay for men and women for equal work. Or, for example, the Italian businessman Andrea Frankovic, who is the person behind a landmark case where the court found that member states could be held liable if they fail to implement EU law. The court decided that individuals have the opportunity to seek damages for failure of implementing EU law from the member state. Another example is the case of Rudik Želček. He was a French student studying in Belgium, and his request for social assistance allowance was rejected because he was a foreign student, and as such he did not have a right to social benefits. However, the court found that the principle of equal treatment can allow EU students studying in another member state to have access to certain social benefits. The court decided that union citizenship guarantees equal treatment, and as a consequence, a French student can have access to certain social benefits in Belgium if he or she fulfills the same conditions as Belgian citizens.
It seems natural now, but it was not always the case, isn't it?
Well, exactly. It was not always so, but for instance, in a case involving an Italian lawyer, Mr. Costa, it was confirmed the principle of primacy of EU law. In substance, this means that whenever there is a conflict between the rules of EU law and those of national law, the EU law prevails, and this guarantees the same application of EU law in all the member states. This goes beyond just the individual rights of individual persons. I'll give you another example of the person who I mentioned first. Jean-Marc Bosman was a Belgian professional football player, and his case before the court sort of revolutionized European football. In that case, the court decided that football players, once their initial contract with the football club expires, are free to move to another club without their initial football club having the right to claim the transfer fee. In the same case, the court also abolished so-called national quotas for national football leagues, and this contributed to a greater movement of football players, and thus sort of revolutionized European football.
Thank you, Matija. You gave us a first glimpse into the emblematic case law of the court, and especially of ordinary citizens' contribution to this case law.
Well, the topic is certainly very broad, and it could be discussed in greater details, and many more cases and many more names could be mentioned.
I'm pretty sure we're going to come back to this topic. And this brings our program to the end. We hope it gave you a useful overview of the citizens' role and the importance of their contribution in shaping the EU law. You can find our programs on the court website and on our social media channels. Thank you for joining us, and see you soon for a new episode.